Good morning for everybody on the Pacific Coast. Hello around the world. This is SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting. Today is February 10th of 2020. Thank you for everybody that has joined today. I hope you are doing fine in these crazy times. We have two items in our agenda today, and I think we should jump into those without wasting any more time. So who will take the lead on the first one? Maybe Kevin?
Yeah, so
Yes.
This was originally brought up by somebody else, but I was doing some similar changes, so I can discuss this. So the big thing here is about some changes to the shared informer interface. And the first change, which was by Mendelsoft's PR, is about adding the ability to remove event handlers and track the number of event handlers on an informer. And basically just wanted to make sure there was no concerns with adding to the shared informer interface these couple methods that get pointed to in this PR. So it's basically on the shared informer, and it adds a remove event handler, an event handler count, and an is stopped and is started, as you can see right there. And there was some discussion and back and forth about whether we wanted to add it to the shared informer interface or create an extended, some sort of extended interface. But this is kind of what what we've settled on, and just wanted to make sure there's no concerns there.
I don't have concerns about adding to the interface. I think that makes sense. This is quite the PR, and it looks pretty involved and intricate. Can it come in? Is this...
You're looking at the second one, right? The one that's so
changing the informer lifecycle.
Yeah, so that one's definitely going to get split up, and that was kind of the next thing I was going to talk about was two interfaces changes there, and this was from I think an earlier discussion we had, but basically what that's doing is kind of three things. One, changing the informer interface to allow the run with stop options, and then the second thing is actually using that change in controller manager, and the third thing is like fixing a bug in garbage collector that now uses that with the new changes will stop spamming Kube controller manager logs. And so that'll get broken up into basically those three discrete pieces, but they were all kind of wrapped together for at least the initial review, to make sure it all makes sense together like that. And that's still kind of going through review with you Liao, but yeah, those will get broken up into three pieces. But wanted to, now that we actually have a PR up for it and are kind of set on the interface changes, wanted to get sign off on those basically, or at least.
So is this one the first one that you want me to put on the screen, right? This one here.
That was that one's smaller, and that one's not. I don't think is not the big one, and not the one that David was concerned about.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, it's the second one. Anyway, I just want to make sure that that you and your reviewers take all due care in that area. So
for sure, yeah, that's still got some things to be done, but yeah. Cool. That's all I've got for that.
Okay, so looks like we are good.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, perfect. That's great. I also have been corrected that we are in the year 2021 and not 2020. So I just wanted to say that for the record in the meeting. Okay, very good. Can we move to the next one? The duck types for Kubernetes.
Howdy. Yeah, can we get a quack quack? No, I don't know. Sorry. I mean, so, okay, right. So I wrote a little proposal here. I wrote a little thing. I basically copy and pasted the same document into the SIG mailing list. There's some more references that you can read based on some of the links in this document. Essentially,
do you want to present? Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, I have a demo.
Okay, so I will.
Would you like to see the demo first?
No, if you want to skim yourself through the documents instead of me, like, just spanning, I can
yeah,
give you.
sure.
I will stop presenting and let you present. Okay.
I'm going to try the new fancy feature of screen share portion. Watch this. Almost there we go. Can you see this little section of my screen here? Okay, so yeah, I wrote this little document. There's some other interesting documents that we've developed over the time, maybe a couple of years ago, describing what we do with duck typing inside of the scope there was Knative, but I think we are ready to kind of talk with the community to bring it upstream into Kubernetes itself. And it would be interesting to be able to start in some sort of SIG repository to enable two things, right? So producing tooling to help generate listers and informers around duck types. Maybe we should start with what a duck type is for the record. So in Knative, what we're doing is we have these resources and they'll have kind of similar shapes sometimes. Like one example would be, like we call it pod specable, but things that have a template and a pod definition, and then those things go off and build pods as a result. So deployments, replica sets, and Knative services. We've chosen this shape on purpose because it lets us kind of target that template piece, and we can make mutations on resources that adhere to that same shape, but without knowing the actual type, right? So this is the point about duck typing is we understand some partial schema contract for the resource in the Kubernetes control plane. We can read or potentially even write to that resource in that partial schema shape without understanding the full schema. And there's a bunch of tricks that we can leverage to do that work. And so the proposal here is we can upstream those tricks, right? So that everyone doesn't have to rewrite them all the time. And if you go down here to the current implementations, this is kind of a short list of where we found code duplication or duplicated efforts of folks that are trying to solve this or a similar problem in the ecosystem of Kubernetes. So it feels like a general enough problem that we can look at what we could do to make common tooling for the community. So I talked about the listers and informers. There's maybe also this new resource kind to discover duck types that are installed in your cluster. And I have a little demo of what you could do with that if you would like to see. Okay. So a little bit of context is, let me move this. Okay, so in Knative, sorry, it's a demo with Knative pieces, but I'm going to show you just pure Kubernetes pieces too. We have something called a Knative service. The service exposes its address, and we use that to be able to understand how to route to it on the data plane, right? So it's going to go through some ingress or whatever, right? Like we don't really know and we don't really care. All we care that is that the partial schema. So if we I'm looking for I don't have a copy of that, but okay, anyway, so actually, sorry, let's just do this demos of the steps. So I'm going to make a Knative service. I have a little, a very, very simple main file here. It's just going to start up an HTTP server, and it's going to report back with hello world if you send nothing to it. I think this is the copy and paste, like how to get an HTTP server from Golang. So let's deploy that. My notes. I'm going to use code to make it quick. And what I just made is a Knative service. And so here it is. It's up and running. And we can curl that endpoint and we get back hello world. That's cool, but we also have this thing in Knative called a domain mapping. And so what a domain mapping does is lets you put a pretty domain onto other services that expose the addressable part, right? So this URL that we showed in kubectl get status is in fact inside the spec because it has to be. So if we look at the partial schema for this thing that I'm calling addressable is status.address.url, right? So that little slice of schema. Okay, and so what I've built is I would like to take things that are addressable and auto give them a domain mapping. And what a domain mapping is a pretty URL that helps me as the request comes into the cluster, things that have domain maps can be looked up, and then the traffic can be routed to the addressable that has been registered for that pretty domain. Okay. So we can make one manually, but what I'm going to show is I call it the sugar controller. It adds sugar syntax onto resources in the cluster. And I can do this because the sugar controller is running on, it's looking at addressable duck types in the system. So I'm going to patch that hello service with a special annotation that the sugar controller is going to recognize. And as a result, it's going to make a domain mapping for the label that was there, right? And so here's the get domain mappings. That thing's shown up. And over here, we have a curl call getting that same URL. So it did, in fact, wire up, but that was fun. We can do other things like a particular feature of the domain map is that you can have multiple routes to the same resource. And so here's a second route coming up and a second curl call coming in. And to show that it's not all just smoke and mirrors, I'm going to deploy a deployment with a service, exact same code. And the interesting thing here is that if you look up at that service definition, I don't have any ingress configured for it. I'm going to allow the domain mapping to do this for me. And this is a particular feature of venting. I'm going to patch that service that was associated to that deployment and give it the special annotation. And we can see that hello world.getrect.dev spun up a domain mapping. It did all the registration and stuff. And now from the outside the cluster, because this is running in Azure, I can ping that internal Kubernetes service. So, and you know, we could do things that you expect, like So I think the first one is called hello. And in this very, very tiny window, we can go and edit the annotations. I don't know, we can, just to show you that it's actually watching this thing, demo.hello. Oop. So that edited, and then if we can get the domain mappings, it updated and it garbage collected that other one because that's what it needs to do. And in this window, I'll show you. How to mistype. So we'll just delete that service and we get garbage collection. All right, so then, so this is all enabled. So basically what's happening in the demo repos is that I have a controller that's looking for something called a cluster duck type of addressable. And here is the CO inside the cluster. And so the specs looks a lot like a CRD, except what it's describing is the partial schema of resources that fit this duck type class. So it's I'm basically classifying things, CRDs that are labeled like this. I special case services like the built-in resource type because I can't label that thing, right? I can't go into the API server and put labels on Kubernetes resources. And then I can I don't know, I define the partial schema, and then the resulting status is every duck that's installed in this particular cluster at this instance, and it shows me all of the things that I can do. So I have this, the sugar controller is watching for this particular resource, and for every duck in this list that's unique, I spin off another controller that's watching for the addressable type based on that GVK. And then I can do some magic with, the demo with the labels and stuff. One example of what you can do. There's other examples in Knative that we have. Cluster API has a ton of very similar examples of what they're doing with partial schemas and contracts on the control plane. And I could go into more details, but I'd like to answer questions or whatever. And this is when you tell me, your mic hasn't worked for the last 15 minutes.
I wanted to put in one clarification, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. There's two pieces here. There's a library on the client side that makes it a lot easier to do listers and informers and watch a duck type.
Yeah.
And there's this CRD that provides a catalog for human beings. The two are independent.
The two are independent. Yes, that's right. And you can,
yeah.
And in fact, you don't need the cluster duck type resource to be able to do the duck typing listers and informers if you know that type, right? So this is just a helper to help you find other ducks that if they've opted in or whatever. But what I'm proposing is we upstream all of that some of those mechanics so that folks have a starting spot to work from.
Let me ask you this: the client side portion, can it, if you didn't compile the client with knowledge of certain like object to interface mappings, can the client still act on those types?
So the slight misspeaking is that it's client gen, not kubectl.
Okay, so it's, the client has to know the mappings at compile time.
So the duck type stuff is dealing with a partial schema, and we generate certain client stuff for the partial schema. We do not need to know ahead of time all of the mappings of like GVKs, GVRs that implement that partial schema. So I can build something that deals with a particular duck type, stand up a controller. I can introduce a new type into the system that might become aware of through various means, and it can start acting on it. So for instance, if it comes across a new resource that has an object ref to a type it hasn't seen before, but the contract of that ref is that thing implements the Scott duck type, right? Then it can basically start to act on that type via those mechanisms.
I have a terminology question. When you say duck type, are you referring to the interface or the things that implement the interface?
Usually we use it to refer to the sort of category, the interface itself.
Okay, all right, thanks.
So in thinking about things that could make this potentially easier, but would be smaller than bringing in an entire client like that, I would probably be thinking about things like an ability to wrap a dynamic client in something that could cast to and from. So you could create a client that was easy to use and cast to your duck types. I would probably be thinking about things like the ability to dynamically start and stop informers based on the pieces that you're doing. Again, that would be sort of a non-contentious step, I would imagine. Having a CRD act as a registry does seem like a significant one that I might be sort of less inclined to immediately embrace.
Is the CRD for the registry required?
It technically wouldn't be, because every client would have to know what they're looking for, but it would take a lot more work, right? You'd have to inspect the open API yourself. And so if they're having an informer, right, that would probably be the way they short circuit and make that appear.
Yeah, I mean, so in general, we have a bunch of machinery for telling users what APIs are supposed to be, and our exposure of them is pretty atrocious, right? Like CRDs have structural schema, but people don't put good comments on them. Where do you go get the comments? How do you keep those up to date? Cube's comments are written by robots for robots in the API docs, no matter how hard we try. But I mean, like it's the most meaningful way that you communicate with a human. There are places I could imagine where, like, drafting on the communication for a human, you can create incentives that reward people for doing the right thing. The registry is a step further, but like going and looking at a whole bunch of open API objects to figure out what the heck kind of kube type is basically the heart of Solly's problem with IDL. And it's the heart of the validation problem in building clients in any language, as well as communicating with humans about what the heck the purpose of a new object shows up. What is it for? Who understands it? So I kind of buy the argument that any investment that we can do that rewards like humans, machines, and duck typing is a good central one. And then some of the other aspects of it that are a little bit more speculative or domain specific, could we structure it so that like those by creating the first set of value, then the second ones start becoming more valuable as well, even if we're not all agreed on it right now.
Yeah.
Can you
Go ahead, Viewlet.
I was just curious, you said you had some hesitations. I didn't, is there some particular, sorry, this is in particular with the registry. Are there just because of the size or not convinced that it might not be needed, or can you say, or the implementation, or can you say a little bit more about that?
It is a case of not being prepared to say, hey, that's great, we should all go ahead and do this right away, and saying, okay, there are some pieces right now that I can see adding value for everyone that would make what you want to do easier. Let's start from there and see how much narrower we can make this kind of a delta.
And that was my gut reaction as well, is like the duck typing idea. Like, I don't even know why we're still discussing it. Like, of course, this is how people deal with systems. This is how humans deal with systems. They look at two workload types and they're like, these both look like workload controllers. And then a whole bunch of people check in.
I know Knative in particular has had some strong opinions, Clayton, and they aren't all universally shared.
But be that as it may, humans go and use APIs. They have to use these systems. They have to understand what's going on. We don't do a great job of like bringing these together in ways that help humans understand, but anything we do in that space probably moves the discussion forward.
So if it wasn't clear in the document, one of the first artifacts that we would try to present is exactly what was asked for. It's a wrapper around dynamic client that helps you get strongly typed listers and informers that result in the instance of the duck type, right? So you get to use the same API client gens that you get, except this thing is a dynamic type that you kind of ask for at runtime.
Yeah. Now, I will say that like some of that challenge is how many people actually can review that sort of a change. Actually, I guess the people that you need to review it are probably exactly the ones currently reviewing Kevin's PR from the beginning of this meeting. But you know, rather than go off and build something in parallel in a different.
David, you brought this up in the background. So like the other concern I have is like, I don't want to say this is not an aspersion on anyone involved in this because we're all equally complicit. Like unstructured is a giant, disgusting mess of like, we put something in place, we haven't moved on, but it's fundamental to the ecosystem. Doing more to work through those, like that is a core cube investment. I think that like, David, I'm speaking on your behalf in the sense of like, we're probably going to need to go make some investments to clean that up over time. It's already a performance issue. CRDs are already like we use a ton of CRDs and it's just like a mess in terms of like a bunch of characteristics of them. So like unstructured and an evolution of unstructured, better client tooling, better mindset around how Open API maps to schema, maps to some of the stuff Solly is talking about These are all like non-obvious or these don't seem like things we wouldn't believe in. It's just how do we piece them out so that they build on each other.
Right, and the repo that I'm asking for is a place to prototype things that its long-term life cycle is probably goes away because they get upstream to other places. I think there was a comment around why don't we just do this inside of like controller runtime, and the answer is that there's more than one way to make a controller, and we would like to downstream this stuff and not have it in Knative, and we don't use
So here's my question. Is there a reason not to like just make this work with the Informer stuff that's in Client Go right now? Like, is that a plausible alternative? Like
we could generate stuff from Client Go. Yeah, sure.
I see. You have to generate stuff. That's right, because we mix everything in our client library. Is the generation? Would it be mandatory for people to perform their own generation, or do you think it would be useful or reasonable to like pre-generate stuff and package it along with the other pre-generated stuff in Client Go?
So I put it as a non-goal to define ducks for Kubernetes. But if there was a group that found some subset of things like objects that have status or ownership reference duck, or right? Like those things could be generated and shipped as an example of like this. Here's what a duck type would look like. Here's how you use it. Here's some typed informers that you give it some GDKs and you get back these like owner refables, whatever they are, right? But you still need the tooling, like that base tooling, to make that all happen. And again, like we're not in Knative. We've made a lot of effort to not reinvent some interface. It's just using like the standard kube client set interfaces for listers, informers, and factories and stuff.
Yeah, I kind of have an ulterior motive for bringing this up, because I'd like, if we take on something like this, like we've got to have. I feel like some things we've taken on and that hasn't really integrated completely yet. With all, like, we own a bunch of SIG API Machinery owns a bunch of sub projects, and I think if we take more on, we need to make sure that there's like a really clear path to how it's going to be well integrated with all the other things that we own. And there's not enough David and I to like personally oversee this. So I like, it has to be like a two-way street, if that makes sense. So that's why, like, if you're going to help us with some Client Go responsibilities, then this actually becomes a bit of an easier sell, if that makes sense.
I also I agree with what Daniel just said there. And so, phasing in carefully and not trying to nuke the world and say, I think this is how clients should be. I think you have a much easier path to success by trying to come in sort of consistent with what we have and build on top instead of changing.
And we could do that. The majority reason why I'm asking for the repo is to prototype that the discovery resource, the cluster duck type, because it's going to be an installable component that has an artifact that's releasable. So like that doesn't really have a good home right now. But if we can find a place for it and it's behind some flags or something, maybe.
So yeah, if the discovery resource is second, at least the way I've understood it and the way I'm envisioning this code, I think the discovery resource is secondary to the fundamental backing, which, as I understand it, you'd have a fair number of pieces built around it. In my head, if I were building it, I'd have a fair number of pieces around it. I want to try to bring in the stuff that is sort of easier to agree on, and then the resource is significant. It would be paired with a controller. There would be issues about opt-in, opt-out. It seems like it may have to wait until people have more time to look at it. the SIG's doing a fair amount this release versus these fundamental underpinnings that would make your life easier about how informers work and about how you wrap them. Those seem smaller, and each one has a clear net win to them.
Yeah, I think we could start there.
Yeah, I think that sounds pretty good to me too. If we take this on as yeah, small chunks that add value without like that sounds like a win to me. And if we're making client go better in the process, that definitely is appealing. Yeah. I agree that I agree with David, like adding a CRD registry, and that sounds a little heavyweight to start out with. I can definitely believe that it'll be useful in the future, but I think there's enough stuff existing already in clusters that if we just made the client work with that, then that'd be good, right? If you start with the registry, then you've got to add a bunch of stuff before that adds value. But if you start with the client, that adds value immediately. So that would be my feeling.
Should I? Okay, so if I should I write a KEP that's like talking about adding this kind of functionality, just the kind of the helper libraries to client gen and things like that? That's the first next step.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. Like, I don't know, David, do you think we should stick it all in one KEP, or do you think there's room for a couple different KEPs here?
I'm trying to think, like, I guess I can see a KEP as a good way to structure and describe it. I would say that the evolutionary change that we described isn't necessarily, like, each individual step isn't necessarily KEP worthy, right? If you bring in and like, so basically I would like to see it. A KEP is a nice structured way to put it. I don't need a huge amount of formal stuff if your piece is small enough, right? If it's small enough to look at it and say, yes, an interface that does this with these inputs and these outputs is a good idea, and it's just a tweak on what we have, I don't think I'd make it like sit through an enhancement cycle, be feature gated, all that stuff. I would look at it and say, okay, this builds on an API that we have. It's the next evolutionary step. Yeah,
client only makes it so much easier because we don't have to feature gate it, and it's just way better.
Eventually, when you do want to create, say, a CRD with this registry, I'm going to come down on, yes, definitely a KEP. We're going to have to sit down and discuss what we want it to do. I don't see a reason to sort of gate everything on that. At least not if I were you. I'd want to get the common infrastructure in that's non-contentious first.
Yeah, that sounds good. And there won't really be any new interfaces defined. It's maybe a new way to ask for a factory, and then everything else is just standard interfaces. Mutation is interesting, and we should talk more about server-side apply because that might help the problem. Because we have to be very tricky about, we have to save the original, or we have to keep the original copy and then diff it with the mutation and then do a patch to apply for spec changes and things like that, or status updates. Although,
it sounds like this would work very well with the apply client that that Antoine and Joe and crew are putting together, because you would be able to just construct something that sets only the fields that you know about.
Fun fact, you commented on the original duck type document to say, like, you should look at this like server-side apply thing in 2018. So
wow, okay.
I'll say now, the client actually exists and we've tried it, and like you should try it early. It's not yet baked fully if changes had to be made.
Yeah, now is a really good time to give feedback on it.
Yeah. A month from now will be a lot harder to change. Like, hint.
Do you all see any value in starting the KEP process on the discovery, given the fact that it takes a little bit longer? Like, if it's, the reason why I asked David about that earlier, it's like, I can certainly see where you're like, look, you're not going to need it. Let's not build it quite yet. But I didn't hear any sort of kind of a strong, like, oh my goodness, it's total garbage. So would it make sense to start that process in parallel with this other work, because it does take a while to get it in?
So I want to be clear. I'm not coming in and saying I think this thing is garbage.
I know that's.
Okay, so in all honesty, given what the SIG is trying to deliver this release, this one and SIG auth, I don't think I have time to sit down and review a CAP for discovery, even if you wrote it.
Got it.
Yeah, I would say you're absolutely welcome to write one. I can't make any promises about reading it in the near future.
Yep.
It's fine. We haven't had it for, and like Knative doesn't quite use it in a lot of places yet because it's fairly new. And I thought, well, we're going to talk about duck types in upstream. Maybe we upstream that concept. But you know, it probably could inform some CRD resource changes and stuff like that too. I wanted to actually, so the one concrete use case for all this stuff is these resources that we've been building that kind of point to other resources. And so how we use the duck type concretely is there's an object reference in a spec of another resource that says, hey, over there, I want to talk about that resource. And the little dotted line that is the object resource, we define that as this must be this duck type, right? And then we can do validation. And then the point of this cluster duck type is potentially you could get some sort of, you know, auto tab complete. I am filling in this box, tab, and it shows me every instance of a duck that's like that in my cluster, and I could select it. So it's really for controller tooling and things like that. So
yeah, I can see how that is handy. But that's going to be like much more extensive changes to our like validation pipeline and like defaulting and all that stuff, which I can't say I'm opposed to, but we have other things that I think are first in line, like making unions work or immutable fields. But yeah, people often ask for or often want things that involve references to like type references. Like, gee, it'd be nice if this part of my CRD were a pod spec, and that we're in sync with the version of pod that's installed in the cluster. And I think we haven't implemented such a feature because it sounds hard. And I think we should definitely consider like that's highly relevant to duck typing, right? Like maybe the right constraint isn't this is a pod spec, but this is matches, you know, whatever this is, it's convertible to this thing. It's convertible to this duck type. Yeah.
And then the long game here is we could bring so once everyone's kind of on the same page around duck typing and these partial schemas, and people start wanting to modify those ducks, we could bring back up the topic of custom sub resources as, you know, an RBackable way to make other controllers control bits of your spec.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
I still think that one's a significantly higher hurdle to cross.
That would definitely be last on the implementation order. Yeah,
types are a more clear, much more clear path forward. Right, I can see my way from here to there.
Yeah, well, I was saying like long horizon, right? Like you can get pretty far on some duck legs.
I would like that duck typing pig picture in whatever cap eventually gets created, because I love that picture.
Yes, duck legs are delicious, by the way. All right. Yeah. Thanks for showing us the demo.
Thanks for listening. So I'll start poking at you know, some client gen stuff.
Sounds good.
Very good. Thank you. And I think we have one more topic. Speaking about the devil, we were mentioning server-side apply. So Joe, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I don't want to belabor this. We'd been asked a while ago. Some people had said there was an interest in hearing an update on how server-side apply was going. So I thought we would just give a really brief update and give some links to people. So we are targeting the 1.21 release for GA. So we have the cups in for that. There's a task list here if anybody wants to look at on the burn down and the progress we've made on various things. So there's a lot of focus in the next month on getting like client support going for this. So we've been working with KubeBuilder, we've been working with Client Go. We've gotten some feedback from the community on those. So that's a push we're making. There's also a couple outstanding items around dangling fields and status wiping and some other things. So I won't say too much more. Antoine, did you have anything you wanted to point out?
No, I think you said it all.
Okay, that's all. Thanks.
I think you're muted if you're talking, Fede.
Sorry, too many screens. I just wanted to ask if, there was anything special that we had to do to address the comments about the client and the topic with duck types that we want to highlight, or no?
I would be certainly happy to talk to people on what we could do. I think probably the first step would be have a look at the KEP for the apply clients. There's a if you just go into enhancements, you can see it there. Or if you can't find it, just ping me on Slack or something. And there's some links around too. But yeah, I would say start by looking at that and seeing how well it fits your needs. I'd be certainly happy to spend some time with somebody talking about it in more detail.
That's great. Very good.
Yeah, during the duck typing discussion, I thought, like, to some extent, maybe apply already allows you to do some duck typing because you can specify a partial spec, so you can like specify only the fields you want to apply, and that should work. But it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty natural. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does less on the read side though, and the read side.
Yeah.
Important.
Right. It doesn't define a mapping. That I guess that's probably the missing piece there.
Yeah, if you could do, like, if I in Go could interact with that object as a strongly typed thing, and then when I go to do the client set stuff, it gets bundled up into the correct parameters for server-side apply. That would be neat.
Yeah, that'd be pretty cool. In fact, I wonder if it would be so cool that the generator should actually generate the builder types that we're introducing with the apply client.
Yeah, I think we
So
should.
Evan just said something really important that I did want to call out. So like, it's hard to watch the duck type with the current client. There's a general problem that like big controllers, big consoles, whatever have, which is watch is complicated to deal with in large scopes. Like you can put a for loop around types and sure that works up to a certain point. We've had some historical stuff over the last few years, people proposing ways of watching multiple things, having better watches. I think there's at least some need to maybe ask some questions and look at some future direction for watch and like watch aggregation, scaling watch. I think watching across multiple namespaces is something that there are a subclass of problems that if we had would be much cleaner. Just whether it's Informer machinery or whether it's actually the API server should support it. There's just a bunch of challenges like this that we're capping out in a few dimensions. That's an area that I specifically would be interested in if namespaces, API groups, clusters, all of those are up. Because essentially, like if you're trying to build anything meaningful that's not a really small controller loop, you're talking 5, 10, 15 resources, and you start wanting to do generic things. The moment you talk about generic things across lots of resources, you basically just open 700 watches and then, oops, lol, your way out of the problem. So it doesn't block this idea, separate problem, but I'd be interested in following up with here on that.
Yeah, I think if there's a separate problem, I would be interested in a, I don't know, concise list of what is blocked on improvements to watch, right? Like a problem statement. And it's probably more than one problem, but I think it would be super helpful to have a list of the actual problems that need to be solved. Because
garbage collector garbage collector was like the first time that we ever really struggled with it, and namespace controller. And those are like, we basically are just like, we'll just watch everything. It's fine. There's a whole class of people out there just hacking this stuff together. And so, yeah, getting a concise group. And Evan, if you're interested, or there's somebody in the Knative space, I'll help connect you with some other people as well.
One free foot gun we found was, so we have this like fancy duck type watcher that's based on the dynamic client, but we also have typed clients. And so we sometimes run into this situation where we know we want to interact with an actual object that's of a certain type, and we interact through its generated typed client, which talks through its cache. But we get invoked to do the reconciliation through the dynamic duck type cache. And so then the two caches are sometimes out of sync, because you get the dynamic event and the typed client cache is still, it hasn't picked up that update yet. So free foot guides, it's fun. So if we could help, solve some of those problems too, that'd be neat.
Yeah, that's yeah, I can see how that could happen. Yeah, Clayton, if you want to, I don't know, do you want to start an email thread or something,
yeah,
issue?
I'll do a call for interested parties and see if we can find the people I know of who are exploring some of these things. I'll try to connect them, and we can maybe see if there's some overlap.
Okay, yeah, yeah, please include me. All right, thanks.
All right. I think that's it for today. I want to thank everybody for the good discussion and the respect. And I hope everybody will stay safe. We'll see you probably in 2 weeks. We'll upload the recording later today, and we'll put it in the agenda. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See ya.